Thank you, Daryl. Hello, everyone.
Hello.
And Daryl, thank you so much for setting this all up and your hard work. The presentation tonight is a little different than the normal author talk, where I want this to be as if you're watching a movie with me, and I'm narrating as we go through these 13 days of the Cuban Missile Crisis. And the type of books I'm attracted to are these stories that, for some reason or other, get overlooked. The book that I'm probably most well known for is The Finest Hours. Has anybody seen that movie? It's about, a few have, it's about a rescue off Cape Cod in 1952. And Disney filmed it all on location. It was really an author's dream come true. But this story caught my attention because I'll bet most of you know about the shoot down of Gary Powers over Russia in 1960. Well, few people know that during the Cuban Missile Crisis, we lost a pilot. And when I learned that, I said, wow, I thought I knew the Cuban Missile Crisis. I had no idea that one of our brave men gave his life protecting us. So that launched the research, and in the course of the research, I discovered 3 other little-known events that had us, about this far away from nuclear war. So this story is about those untold stories, but also a little bit about Kennedy's decision-making, how we got through to the other side without having World War III. Lately, I've been, besides Above and Beyond, focusing on the Cuban Missile Crisis, been focusing a little bit on World War II, and Allison O'Leary, who's here with me tonight, and we wrote this book so close to home, and this is a story that takes place basically in your backyard. It's about the first U-boat that came into the Gulf of Mexico, traveled all the way to the mouth of the Mississippi River, sank a freighter that had a family of 4 on board. And Allison and I thought this would be a great survival at sea story. What happens to this family after the big ship is sunk? But in the course of our research, we found the war diary from the U-boat commander who sank their ship. So now, all of a sudden, we see it from 2 perspectives. So oftentimes in the book, the chapters alternate between what's happening with the family adrift in the ocean and what's going on in the U-boat. I had no idea U-boats could come all the way from occupied France across the Atlantic and spend 2 weeks in the Gulf of Mexico and go all the way back without being refueled. So the German U-boat was quite advanced for the time period. So we decided, the co-author and I decided to tell this story from the perspective of the U-2 spy plane pilots. And this is what a U-2 spy plane looks like, an amazing aircraft that can fly 13 miles above the earth, so over 70,000 feet. And we knew that that's so high that a Soviet MiG couldn't reach it. But again, we learned with Gary Powers in 1960, a surface-to-air missile could. So while for the most part the pilots were safe up there, they had that one vulnerability to the surface-to-air missiles. There's another vulnerability though, and that's that when you're in that little cockpit, if you were to lose air pressure, the air is so thin up there, your blood would begin to boil within 60 seconds, so you'd be dead. And these pilots would wear these pressure suits to mimic the air pressure on Earth if the cockpit lost air pressure. And so this is a Florida native, Steve Heiser, I use this to show you what the pressure suit looked like, but he's actually the pilot who discovered the nuclear missiles in Cuba. And he would wear that astronaut-style helmet. And as I was researching the pressure suits, it was funny. I'm from Massachusetts, and I found out that the pilots told me, they said, oh, that's where the pressure suits were made. And I said, where? And they said, they were made in a bra and a girdle factory in Worcester, Mass. And they said they would be brought in and taken to the basement, And there'd be this black door, they'd go in the door, and there'd be this little tailor, and they'd have to step up on a block. There'd be one hanging light bulb. And he said, he measured us. He said, take every stitch of your clothing off, I'm going to measure you. And they couldn't believe it. The next day they come back to the bra and girdle factory, and the whole pressure suit would be ready to go. And more than one pilot told me that pressure suit from Worcester, Mass. Saved my life. So the stakes couldn't be higher when we get into the Cuban Missile Crisis. I was shocked to learn just how many and how many types of nuclear weapons we had and that the Russians had. And I can only imagine today with the power increasing. So here's a little background. I'm going to move off to the side. Castro overthrows Batista in 1959. A dictator, one dictator overthrowing another, basically. Then we launch, with our backing, the U.S. backing, the Bay of Pigs, which was a disaster. You probably remember, some of you folks. But from my perspective in writing the book, I look back and I go, you know, the Bay of Pigs was a blessing in disguise because it happened on Kennedy's watch, and he learned so much from this incident. The idea was hatched under the Eisenhower administration, and the training went on under the Eisenhower administration, but it was Kennedy who had to execute it, and he made a series of mistakes, the biggest of which he didn't ask enough questions. And then right at the end he got cold feet, and he withdrew some air support. So it was just doomed to failure. But the good news was he learned. You know, that happened in the first months of his presidency. And then you have the Soviet build-up in 1962, and of course that's in response to the failed Bay of Pigs action. And then Steve Heiser, who I showed you earlier, he takes his U-2 over Cuba because by now we're starting to hear rumors from spies that there could be nuclear weapons, and he gets the first photographs on October 14th. So the crisis basically goes from October 14th to the 27th of October. I thought Khrushchev might be a little off balance because remember he took his shoe off and was pounding the podium. But you know what? After researching him, my conclusion changed. He was a shrewd operator, worked his way up through the war, became the supreme leader, and amazingly, his son, Sergei, is now a U.S. citizen living in Rhode Island. So I was able to interview him, and Sergei was old enough at the time of the Cuban Missile Crisis to have discussions with his dad while it was going on. So in the book, Above and Beyond, you see some of Khrushchev's thought process as told to me by Sergei, who would ask his dad questions as this was happening. And you know, besides being a military threat, these missiles in Cuba, they could reach Washington, D.C. in just 9 minutes. Kennedy said it's a political threat. In other words, he thought he'd be impeached if he allowed the missiles to stay there. And looking back on it, I think he was right. I don't think the American public would have stood for it. So he looked at it as both a military threat and a political threat as well. So when I tackled this topic, I was probably, just like you folks, interested in history, but was not a Cuban Missile Crisis expert. So I decided to write the book for the general population, not for the people who are experts. So I was learning as I went, and I was very surprised to see that the island of Cuba is 780 miles long. I never knew it was that big. And I didn't know where our Guantanamo Bay was. I didn't know where the Bay of Pigs was. And by the way, one of the reasons the Bay of Pigs failed is that they switched the landing site right at the last minute. And picking the Bay of Pigs spot was the worst place possible. It was all swamp. These guys who landed got mired down in the swamp. There was no mountains to hide out in. So now I'm going to introduce you. In the book, there's 4 lead characters. You know, having done 30 books, I've learned if you introduce too many characters, you're going to lose the reader. And I'm the same way. When I read a book, if that first couple of chapters bogs down, I just move on. There's so many good books out there. So we're going to focus on 4, and I want to introduce you to the 4. The first one is Jerry McElmoyle, and Jerry is the youngest of the U-2 spy plane pilots who were assigned the task to fly over Cuba once we got the information about the nuclear missiles. So there's pilots, 10 of them, and Jerry was the youngest, and they're stationed right here in Florida at McCoy Airfield in Orlando. So a lot of the book takes place right in this area, and you could only imagine what Orlando must have looked like in 1962 before Disney World. McCoy must have been pretty much it. So Jerry is central to the story, and you'll see why in a minute. Jerry's boss was Major Rudy Anderson. Rudy was an interesting guy because although he was in the Air Force and he was involved in the Korean War, he was a pacifist. He didn't want to kill people. He didn't want to drop bombs. So he was always volunteering for reconnaissance missions. And he was getting quite a reputation as a great surveillance pilot. And when the Korean War ended, the CIA knew he was a good pilot, so they recruited him into the U-2 program. Because at that time, the U-2 had just been developed. They needed the best pilots they could get. The U-2s are very difficult to fly. They're temperamental. No two are exactly the same, so each one has a little different touch and feel to it. And Rudy was one of those pilots good enough to enter the program, most washed out, because oftentimes you'd be up in the U-2 for 6 hours to 8 hours all alone, no radio communication, no nothing, and you had to really be focused. And a lot of pilots just washed out because then the landing was so difficult. So you'd go from kind of 8 hours of almost boredom to then this hair-raising landing. But Rudy stayed in the program, so he became one of the elite U-2 pilots. Chuck Maultsby was another one. He fought in the Korean War, and he was a fighter aircraft pilot and was shot down by the Chinese. And he said he was taken a POW, and for 3 years he lived in a little earthen cave, 4 feet by 4 feet. Can you imagine 3 years in the earth, basically? And when they finally did the prisoner exchange and he was released, I was shocked that he went back into the Air Force. There's no way after that ordeal you'd get me up on a plane. I would have become a farmer, you know. But he re-ups. And again, the CIA recognizes the really good pilots because after the Korean War he became a Thunderbird pilot, and they recruited him into the U-2 spy plane program, and he passed. So those are the 3 U-2 pilots we're going to follow through this story. And of course, President Kennedy. Now, when I was starting the book, I knew President Kennedy would be a character, but I didn't know, to what level. And then after a few weeks into the research, I realized, oh my God, Kennedy secretly audio recorded every meeting he had on the Cuban Missile Crisis. So you can listen to these people arguing about the fate of the world. And the people who were in the cabinet room never knew that he was recording them. So Nixon wasn't the first to do secret tape recordings in the White House. Kennedy had done it. I think he was doing it for his own use after he had left the office, because he was a writer. He had done profiles in courage. He was probably thinking about his own memoirs and wanted these tapes. So Kennedy went from being, maybe he'll be, a minor character in the book to a major character because we know exactly what was discussed during the crisis. And in the book, I put in the more vivid scenes where they're arguing, and the arguments are getting really tense, or they're discussing the U-2 program, because again, a lot of this story is told from the eyes of the pilots who are putting their lives on the line. So the crisis begins when Steve Heiser does that overflight of Cuba. By the way, so there's no digital film. This is old-fashioned. He'd have to fly over Cuba, come all the way back to McCoy, land. They'd have to unload a mile-long worth of film. Then that would be rushed onto a jet, flown to Washington, and there in a secret laboratory, it would be analyzed to see what they got on their photos. And incredible, again, they're 13 miles up, and they're getting some pretty good photos. So Kennedy's informed while he's having breakfast, and I do a version of this program for colleges and for business groups that gets into the steps Kennedy took to his final decision to resolve this. And in my research, I came up with 14 steps that he took. So tonight I'll talk about a couple of them, not all 14, but it was a great lesson for me, and it can work for really anybody. If you've got a major decision in your life, he puts forth a pretty good blueprint of how to take the steps to reach your goal, and I'll talk about a few. One of the first steps is to find out how much time you have to make your decision. So in other words, he said, when he was shown the pictures, first he said, are you sure there's missiles there? Because I think there's a photo coming up. I don't see any missiles. You can't. Kennedy couldn't. And the people said, no, Mr. President, we've had all our experts in. We have the ability to expand these photos and enlarge them back at our lab. The lab was so secret, the CIA housed it above a used car dealership in Washington, D.C. So nobody even knew it was there. And they assured him 100% that what they were looking at were medium-range ballistic missiles. But his main question, though, was about establishing, well, how much time do I have? In other words, he says, are the missiles operational? And they go, no, sir, we don't believe they are. And he goes, when will they be operational? And they go, our best estimate is in about 2 weeks or less, maybe 10 to 14 days. So now he knows how much time he's got, because he's immediately come to the conclusion the missiles have to go. That's going to be non-negotiable. And again, when I analyze really good decision makers, and by that I mean in these other books I've written that are true survival at sea stories and incredible rescues by the Coast Guard rescue swimmer and helicopter pilots, I've learned how these people survive. And they always have a goal, and that goal is, say do the rescue, get the missiles out, whatever it may be. But the plan to reach the goal is always flexible, constantly changing. And you'll see in this program how Kennedy changes his mind several times. Now, today we put a label on it, oh, that's flip-flopping, but it's not at all. Not when the fate of the world is at hand. You're taking new information in, and you're forming a new conclusion to get you to that goal. So he wants to know how much time he has, and he's told roughly that 2-week period, because once the missiles are operational, in other words, once they've got the warheads on them and they're on the launch pad, they've got the U.S. over a barrel. No matter what we do, they could threaten to fire them, and they're going to be here within minutes. So he wants to make sure they're out of there before they're operational. So his second decision, and this is a good one again for all of us, and again when I speak to students, I say if you got a really big decision, get your best group of advisors, friends, or they don't even have to be friends, just people you value their brilliance, their opinions, because you want differing opinions. So he calls his group the ExComm, the Executive Committee of the National Security Council, but it's not everybody in the National Security Council. He handpicks who's going to be in his committee, and then he supplements that with people from different walks of life. Like, of course, the CIA would be there. McCone, he was the head of the CIA. He's the one who really had the first hunch that the Soviets were installing offensive weapons. But he would pick other people like the head of the Treasury, and I'm thinking, why would the Treasury be there? But then as I studied it, I realized Kennedy really had respect for this man's brain power. And he even had people who weren't Democrats on board. That wasn't his concern. He's looking for this wide assortment of people. So it was very interesting. Just 2 weeks ago, I was reading in the newspaper in the current administration, one of the earlier chief of staffs, when he left the Trump administration, they said, "What was your parting advice?" And he said, "I told the president, don't surround yourself with yes men." And that's what Kennedy did here. He had this diverse group who he knew was going to debate. The microphones were actually hidden in the bookcase. And while I don't know for sure if Bobby knew it, I have a hunch Bobby knew that they were being taped because he was by far the president's closest confidant. Whenever a big decision had to be made, the last person he'd run it by would be Bobby. And so you see in this picture, there's LBJ sitting down. Very interesting. LBJ didn't say much during the crisis, and when he did speak, usually it was when Kennedy left the room. And I don't know why. I knew he and Bobby, they literally hated each other. I knew that. But I could never figure out why he was reluctant to speak up when the president was in the room. But anyways, you see Kennedy leaning over the table, McNamara's there, and this is the core of the group. And then they'd bring in, we might refer to them as guest speakers, but they'd be somebody with a expertise in a certain area, such as the person who was the head of that National Photographic Interpretation Center. So Kennedy says, okay, we know there are nuclear missiles there. We need to prepare for war. We need as many overflights now of the U-2s as we can get. So prior to that flight by Steve Heiser that discovered them, all our flights were on the periphery because Kennedy didn't want another Gary Powers shoot down. And then once we discovered their missiles, he says all bets are off. We need the pilots to go right over the island. So the next one to fly is Major Rudy Anderson. And he does this long flight over the island. He's got 4 targets. And again, when I say targets, there's no bombs on these aircraft. It's just cameras. Flick the switch, photograph the target, go on to the next one. And when he comes back and they analyze his film, they find out it's not just 1 or 2 missiles outside of Havana. San Cristobal was the main site. There are several sites scattered around the island of Cuba. So the Soviets were way ahead of what we thought they were doing in terms of their military buildup on the island. The early versions of the U-2, the plane's wings were so long and heavy that sometimes when they took off, they would scrape on the ground. And they came up with this simple solution. Put these pogo sticks underneath the wings that are not attached to the aircraft. So as soon as it lifts off, the pogo sticks fall away. And then I'm like, well, what about landing? Aren't they going to scrape the wings? And they said, no, you've used your fuel up, so the aircraft is lighter, the wings are lighter, and they don't scrape. And now I've never been in a U-2, flown a U-2, but apparently the way they take off is unlike any other aircraft. It has a whining noise. It's got a jet engine on the back. I call it a glider on steroids because it's such a lightweight aircraft. And then it just goes at this almost straight up, they say. They say it's incredible to see. And then when it gets to that 13 miles, then it's cruising. And that's where they feel they're the safest. So the reason they assembled the pilots in Orlando was, 1, of course, proximity to Cuba, to be close. But 2 is the weakness of the U-2 photographs was it couldn't pierce cloud cover. So they had to make sure they had good weather, and they'd wait for the proper weather report. If the skies were clear over Cuba, off they go. And it only took maybe 40 minutes to get to Cuba, so this was the ideal place for them to launch from. And for those of you who might be native Floridians, you probably remember, if you're of a certain age, that all our military resources were coming down to Florida, preparing for perhaps an invasion of Cuba. When you study the Kennedy tapes, And there is a book about that as well that has the complete tapes. It's about this thick, and it's simply called the Kennedy tapes, but it shows you who's talking and when. And again, I went through that and carefully took out the more dramatic parts, put it in our book. But in the first 2 days of the crisis, there's a consensus of the group, and that is, we're going to go in and bomb the missile sites in Cuba. And maybe, they haven't come to a consensus yet, but maybe follow it up with a D-Day style invasion. Our government wanted Castro out of there. Once he started nationalizing some U.S. resources in Cuba, in fact, Bobby Kennedy was put in charge of the Mongoose Committee, which was basically an assassination committee, come up with ideas of how to eliminate Castro. So they're thinking, if we're going to bomb the heck out of Cuba, we might as well invade as well. But again, they're still gathering intelligence about where the Soviets are, how many, and what are their capabilities. And we woefully underestimated what the Soviets had done in Cuba. There's a funny story behind this picture. That's the Soviet foreign ambassador and ambassador to the UN sitting across from Kennedy. Kennedy's in his favorite rocking chair because remember how his back hurt from his... We write about his experience in PT 109 because it is important to realize this guy had seen combat up close and personal, and it does affect some of his decisions. But you can almost see Kennedy's body language, and I call it the leaning back going, oh really? Because he knows the missiles are in Cuba. This is on day 3 of the crisis. These two gentlemen have brought up the subject of Cuba, and they say, Mr. President, yes, we have Soviet forces there because you did the Bay of Pigs. But they said, we assure you there's no offensive weapons there, and there's certainly no nuclear missiles. Now, Kennedy can't tip his hand that he knows, so that's why I'm giving you the oh really pose. Because as soon as they left the room, he goes to Bobby, I can't believe they lied to me right in the Oval Office. It was all I could do not to run over to my desk and pull out the photos and shove it under their nose. But he can't tip his hand because he hasn't decided what to do. So, you know, until he makes the announcement to the American public, he certainly doesn't want to let the Soviets know that we know the missiles are there. By the way, I was shocked that his back was in so much pain, he would travel around, if he was, you know, traveling around the country with a little black bag of painkillers. Yet on the Kennedy tapes, he's always lucid, always in charge. I don't know how you do that if you're on painkillers, but that's how bad his back was. And he'd always adjourn this, these meetings at noon, not just to have lunch, but so that, one, he could take a short swim in the pool. That seemed to alleviate the pain. And oftentimes he'd take this quick cat nap. So I never feel bad when I take my cat naps. Hey, if the president did it, I can do it. But yeah, he was in considerable pain. Curtis LeMay, his nickname was Bombs Away LeMay. And he was at these meetings, and he's advocating, and from a military perspective, he was correct. We got to hit him now, Mr. President, while we have the element of surprise. You're delaying, and that's giving them more time to prepare. You know, leaks are going to get out. They're going to know we know. And Kennedy, in the beginning, is saying, yes, the plans are being put together. You're putting it together. You're head of the Air Force. You're head of Strategic Air Command. And that's the path we're going on. But there's times when LeMay is borderline insubordinate. One time he says to Kennedy, you're looking awfully weak, Mr. President. Another time he goes, he says, Mr. President, you're in a bad fix. And Kennedy goes, what did you just say? And LeMay goes, I said you're in a bad fix. And Kennedy, to his credit, he breaks the tension and he goes, well, you're in it with me. And, you know, he's like, we're not on different teams. We're on the same team. I'm going to make the final decision, though. But LeMay's putting big time heat on him, saying every hour you delay is one less. And later, when the heat's being put on Kennedy, he uses a phrase that I heard him say 3 different times. He says, when they say, start the bombing today, he goes, you might feel differently when the blood begins to flow. In other words, I think going back to his own combat days, it's easy to make all these plans, but plans never go according to the way we think. And once lives are lost, everything gets out of hand. So Kennedy surprises LeMay by not taking his advice and taking a new tact, and that's the blockade. Some people whisper in his ear, good, trusted advisors say, we don't think that's going to work, Mr. President, and he says, you're probably right, but that's just one step. His thinking is, if we do the bombing that he originally was leaning towards, and he's changed his mind, there's no coming back from it. You're probably into World War III. LeMay didn't think so. He asked LeMay, what do you think he'll do when we kill some Russians? LeMay said, they'll do nothing. Kennedy goes, you really believe that? LeMay goes, yes, we're stronger and they know it. Kennedy goes, I think at the very least they're going to take West Berlin, and I think they're going to fight back on Cuba. But anyways, he does give LeMay one, I call it like throwing him a bone. He says, but if they shoot down one of our U-2s, you, the Air Force, have permission to go in and wipe out that surface-to-air missile site, and we'll probably want to hit some others as well. So he's given the military that assurance. Then he goes on TV, and by the way, his number one concern was that this thing was going to spin out of control without his knowledge, without his direction. In other words, somebody's going to do something, or there's going to be some screw-up that causes us to get into World War III. And part of that thinking was he was reading a book at the time called The Guns of August, which is how the country stumbled into World War I. And he doesn't want to repeat that. And just as an interesting little side story, Sergei Khrushchev said, you know what my father's number one concern was? I said, no, what? He said that somebody on the ground would have a different agenda and do something, some miscalculation, and the next thing you know, we're going to be in war without my father authorizing it. And I was like, wow, that was the exact same fear Kennedy had. And as you'll see in a couple slides, that's exactly what happens. DEFCON 2, we're at that state just below actually being in war. So we've got bombers circling 24/7, loaded with nuclear weapons. His address to the nation's a good one, I thought, because he's forceful, yet he's calm. So he's not panicking people, but I know the anxiety level was high. I've interviewed different people, and like one woman said, as soon as he was done, my father went into the backyard, started digging a bomb shelter. And another woman, she had this story that was great. She goes, I was a schoolgirl, I went to school the next day, and at the end of the day, the teacher goes, there'll be no homework tonight because there won't be a tomorrow. Can you imagine saying that to a kid? But that's how so many people felt. I've heard the stories over and over. And it gets worse on the next day because the Russians say a blockade is illegal, we're on the path to nuclear war. So that's the headline. So anxiety that was high during Kennedy's speech has just gotten a lot higher. And so now Kennedy's thinking, okay, they may or may not, obey this blockade line. And you'll see in the book there's some ships that turn back, others that test it. But he decides we're probably going to be at war, so we need as much intelligence as we can. So now let's start flying Navy Crusaders over Cuba. And these were very different than the U-2s. These were going 500 miles per hour at treetop level, just zooming over. The Cubans would, shoot rifles at them, but they could never hit them. And you wouldn't think at that speed they could get good photographs, but the technology in 1962 was pretty darn good, and this is one of the ones that the Navy Crusaders shot. So in that big long tent is the missile, and then you see Soviet forces around it, just outside this picture would have been the surface-to-air missile sites protecting the nuclear missile. Adlai Stevenson. I often thought he didn't get enough credit during this crisis because by coincidence, on the first day of the crisis, he happened to be at the White House. So of course, Kennedy took him aside, told him what's happening. And Adlai said, hey, I have an idea. We can end this peacefully and fast. And the president said, what's that? And he said, we should offer to take our missiles out of Turkey in exchange for the Russians taking theirs out of Cuba, which is what Kennedy eventually did. But at the time, Kennedy thought it was a terrible idea. When Adlai left the room, he said to Bobby, whose side is Adlai on anyways? So it's very interesting. It was Stevenson's idea that Kennedy later adopts, but at first he thinks it's terrible. And then he trots out the photos Stevenson does to show the world why we're doing this blockade in international waters. Oftentimes I look at this picture and I could just see, not too long ago, Colin Powell in front of the UN showing weapons of mass destruction, which weren't really there, which led to the Second Iraq War. But in this case, the military advice was correct in terms of the surveillance. There were nuclear missiles, and we had good intel. So now it's Jerry's turn to fly. Remember, Jerry's the youngest pilot, and he's eager to serve his country. He said it was actually quite beautiful when you're up there. He said the lush jungles, the green of Cuba and the blue ocean, and you're so high up you could see the curvature of the earth. But then he goes, you're being tracked by Soviet radar. And this goes back to Khrushchev's fear. Somebody on the ground does something they were not authorized to do. Khrushchev's instructions were, don't shoot down any U.S. planes. The thinking being, the missiles are almost operational, then we've achieved our objective. So no need to shoot down a U.S. plane. But somebody on the ground, and we don't know all the details, decides to either send a warning shot or to try to take out Jerry. And two contrails come up, and Jerry said, I could see him in my rear view mirror. And I said, your U-2 has a rear view mirror? And he goes, oh yeah, they're not that sophisticated. And when he told me the story, I thought it was just so jaw-dropping. I said, I'm going to start the book with that. That's the hook. It's so incredible. And then backfill a little bit how we got into this position. So picture Jerry's in the air. He's over his last target, over Banyas, Cuba. He sees in the rearview mirror a contrail coming up. He knows what it is. And then he sees the starburst, which is the shrapnel exploding of the SAM. But he's a good half mile away. And I said, what'd you do? And he said, I did what I'm trained to do, and that's take pictures. So he said, I banked the aircraft, flicked the switch, I got the contrail, got the starburst. Then he said there was a second one a little bit further behind and higher. He said, I got that on film, then I got the hell out of there. And he said, when I landed in McCoy, he said, of course, the normal debriefing, the CIA was always there and the Air Force brass, and I told them what happened, and they grilled me. And he said, then when I went back to the barracks, I told the other pilots, hey, they're shooting at us. And the strange part of this episode is the next day, Jerry's walking out on the tarmac to his aircraft, and Jerry's last name is McAmoyle, so if you could picture, he's walking out, and he hears McAmoyle, and he turns around, and it's a 3-star general. He doesn't know who it is, but he sees the 3 stars. And he goes, yes, sir. And the general goes, I just got off the plane, I just flew down from Washington, we've analyzed your film and there was nothing on it. And Jerry goes, sir, I'm certain I got the contrails and the starburst. The general goes, there was nothing on it, so we destroyed both your film and your intelligence report because you were mistaken. And Jerry goes, sir, I know what happened, I saw it. And finally the general goes, do you know what I'm telling you? In other words, zip it up. And we don't know for sure why he did that, but the theory, and this is Jerry's as well as my own, is that somebody at a high level below Kennedy didn't want this information to get to the president because he'd probably stop the U-2 overflights. He's not going to want another Gary Powers situation where they parade a captive pilot, or they have our U-2 technology. So somebody near the top squelched this so that Kennedy wouldn't stop this intelligence gathering. I said to Jerry, did it look like that? And he said, no. He said, once the surface-to-air missile explodes, it's like that just for a second, but then he says it's a starburst, meaning the shrapnel comes out. And he says all it takes is one piece of shrapnel to bring down a U-2. It's such a lightweight, kind of a flimsy aircraft, as he called it. So now we're up to day 13, and if you can imagine having one of those days where everything goes wrong, this is one of those days for the president. And I thought I'd tell you about 2 or 3 of the events that happened on this day. One, I won't tell you the full story, because if you read the book, there should be surprises. So this one, the one I'll stop short, is quite a surprise. But the first incident involves, oh, by the way, Kennedy's only 43 years old. Isn't that amazing, that pressure at that young age? I would have cracked, but again, he's always in charge of these meetings. And again, I think it goes back to the Bay of Pigs. He's determined not to let it get out of his control, where he makes the decision and he's got every question answered first. So Soviet sub B-59 is approaching the blockade line. We've told the Russians, if we detect one of your subs, we're going to drop practice depth charges to mean we found you. You're supposed to come up and move away from the quarantine line. Whether that message got to the commander of B-59, I don't know. But the men on the sub said, we were bombed so many times with these depth charges. They said it felt like we were in a steel drum and somebody was taking a sledgehammer to it. And the conditions were awful in there, very similar to the U-boat conditions that went into the Gulf of Mexico, even though a lot of years have transpired since World War II. It's hot as hell, over 100 degrees, water was being rationed. The air quality is terrible from the batteries, the batteries that operate the sub. And the commander thinks, these aren't just practice depth charges, this is World War III. So he's, after about an hour of being depth charged, he thinks this is it. So I have authorization, in my head he's thinking this, to prepare our one special torpedo, he called it, which is a nuclear-tipped torpedo. And he actually has the men load it in firing tube number 3, and then it's just luck that he doesn't fire it. And the reason, and this is where luck and fate can make all the difference, the reason is there's another commander on board who doesn't have command over this sub, but he's the flotilla coordinator, so he's got an equal rank. He says to the commander, we don't have authorization to launch the nuclear torpedo. That has to come directly from Moscow. We don't know that World War III is broken out. And they get into this argument. And thank God, Sergei Arkhipov wins the argument and talks this guy down off the ledge. So while a lot of people give 100% of the credit to Kennedy, Arkhipov gets some of the credit for preventing nuclear war as well. And it was just coincidental that he's on this sub. Remember, Chuck Maultsby was the pilot, held in that 4 foot by 4 foot earthen cave. Well, you think, what's he got to do with the story if he's stationed in Alaska? And his orders are, fly over the North Pole in your U-2, long flight, going to be an 8-hour flight, and they've put in this carbon paper that can collect radioactive samplings, get the radioactive samplings, and then return, and it's going to be a nighttime flight, which means, once you're over the Arctic ice barrens, you're going to have to rely on celestial navigation. So they've planned for every contingency. A couple planes escort him to the last landmass and the last radio beacon. Then he's going to be on his own. Then he's going to come back and they'll guide him home. The one thing they don't plan on is the Aurora Borealis. So he can't see the stars. And he's worried. He thinks this is going to go by in 5 or 10 minutes, and it doesn't. So he can't get his star fixes, and now he knows he's off course, but not how badly. Puts out a coded distress signal. It can't be reached. He's so far north. And he said, after a couple hours of being lost, truly not knowing exactly where he was, he says, I do have a radio, so I'm trying different frequencies to maybe think about a different distress signal. And he said, I heard Russian music. You don't want to hear Russian music if you're a U.S. Air Force plane during the Cuban Missile Crisis. And so he strayed into Soviet airspace. So he left from Eisen Air Force Base at the bottom of the screen. He's gone over Barter Island. That was his last radio contact. And somewhere near the North Pole is when the polar lights come out. And then he makes his way back, and he's far to the west over that Chukotka Peninsula. And the Soviets are tracking him. They know something's coming. Some of them think it might be the vanguard of an attack from the U.S. So they send up 4 MiGs to shoot down this intruder. Normally the U-2's too high for MiGs to get, but he looks at his fuel gauge and it's about on empty. So here's where I'll stop that story there, because the next part is so strange you think I'm making it up. So I want there to be surprises in the book. But the story just gets stranger and stranger as it goes on. And I'll give you this one tip. He does say to himself, I've been a POW once, it's not going to happen again. So at the same moment that he's lost, his friend, Rudy Anderson, down in Orlando, is going to launch for a mission over Cuba to photograph more sites. Rudy had the most flights over Cuba of any pilot. He had 5. And that's what he wanted. He wanted to be known as the best reconnaissance pilot there was. So he's going to do a long flight. And by the way, Kennedy, there were some CIA pilots that could have flown, but Kennedy said, nope, I don't want any CIA aircraft. If there is a CIA aircraft, I want it painted with the U.S. Air Force, and I only want U.S. Air Force pilots. I think going back to the Bay of Pigs, where he thought maybe the CIA had some responsibility. But so the CIA was livid. I remember reading one of the CIA officials when Kennedy said, we're going to change things, it's just going to be Air Force. He goes, that's a hell of a way to run a railroad. In other words, you're switching tactics in the middle of a crisis. But Kennedy stuck to his guns. And Rudy's going to come in over Havana, and he's going to do the length of the island, and his 4th target's going to be near Guantanamo Bay, a sensitive area. There were tactical battlefield weapons there that the Soviets had outside of Gitmo, so I think that's why that was sensitive. 2 Russian generals on the ground are tracking him. They do try to get authorization to shoot him down. They can't get a hold of the supreme commander of Soviet forces in Cuba. He was deathly sick just by coincidence. And so they decide, well, he's sick, we're next in command, we're going to make the decision, and we're going to shoot down this pilot who's heading over our sensitive area. So they call Banyas, where the surface-to-air missiles are, and they say, destroy target number 33. They had this giant screen, like twice the size of this one, where they could track Anderson's flight. And each flight had a different number, and this was target number 33. So they've relayed the message. Contrary to what Khrushchev has said, they've decided they have the leeway to do this. And off go the surface-to-air missiles. Now, this next part I'm speculating a little bit, but I think I'm on target. That I don't think the surface-to-air missiles hit the aircraft. You'll see why in a minute. But shrapnel must have. And I searched and searched for a photo of the downed aircraft that Major Anderson was flying, and finally found one. And you'll see it in a second, but I called up my go-to man, Jerry McElmoyle, who later became a brigadier general. And I said, Jerry, if a U-2 was hit at 13 miles, it should come down in pieces no bigger than my hand, right? It just would disintegrate. And he said, not necessarily. He said, if a U-2 is wounded, and I'll never forget the way he explained it, he said, picture a leaf spiraling down slowly from a tree. He said, first one wing is going to come off, then the next, and then the tail. And then sure enough, when I found the photo, it was pretty much how Jerry described it. Major Anderson's body was in the cockpit. He was dead. He never got off a Mayday. He never tried to eject, so it must have been fast. But I was just shocked that this much of the aircraft survived and hit the ground after coming down 13 miles. So again, it must have come down in that slow fashion. So this photo was taken by a Cuban. So you would think this would be the opportunity for Curtis LeMay. They've killed one of our pilots to go in and bomb the surface-to-air missile sites, which he was anxious to do. And Kennedy frustrates him again and says, not yet. And LeMay, as soon as he left the cabinet room, goes, he chickened out again. I can't believe it. We've lost a pilot, and he's still not doing anything. Kennedy, however, thinks this is it. It's out of control. He knows a little bit about the Chuck Maultsby incident. I don't think he knew about sub B-59 at this part, but he now knows about Major Rudy Anderson. You'll see in the book how he's told about Anderson. Very odd way. Big gap of time between when the military knew he was shot down and when they decide to tell Kennedy. I don't know why, but big gap. But he decides, this is it. It's out of control. I got to give it one last shot. So he pulls Bobby aside privately, and he says, go to the Soviet foreign minister. And he never uses the word ultimatum, but that's basically what it is. He says, military operations are going to be imminent. Here's our last offer. You withdraw your missiles out of Cuba. We will promise not to invade the island. And at a later date, and by the way, this has to be kept private, we will withdraw our missiles out of Turkey. So that's the deal that's cabled to Khrushchev. And Sergei goes, when my dad got that offer, he jumped on it and took it. And I said, why? And he said, because everything he feared was happening. Things were out of control. He had already cabled Cuba to those surface-to-air missile operators saying, you were too hasty. I never gave the orders to shoot down one of the U-2s. So, and Khrushchev never did publicly say about the secret exchange with the Turkish missiles. We did that months later. We kept our end of the deal, and Khrushchev kept his by keeping it, just between him and the Politburo. LeMay was furious. He thought this was our chance to finally get rid of Castro and take over Cuba. And he thinks this deal is a bad deal, and we're never going to be in a position where we're this much stronger than the Soviets, and we should have taken it. But Kennedy was thinking millions of people are going to be killed. This is going to escalate into nuclear war. So two very different perspectives. Kennedy goes on national TV to explain the situation to the public. He does tell his advisors, no gloating. The missiles aren't out of there yet, so don't act like this is a big victory. Rudy Anderson's body was returned. Jerry McElmoyle is the one who gave me this photo. And he said, Mike, when they did the autopsy, they found a tiny piece of shrapnel had pierced his pressure suit. So he might have died instantly, not from the shrapnel, but from the lack of the air pressure. And you'll read in the book how his wife goes through hell, because at the time, and it may still be this way in the military, if a service member is killed or leaves the military, you, the family, have to leave the base within a 2-week period. And she's got kids in school. And by the way, she's already been through a lot. A year earlier, the military knocked on her door, this is a year earlier now, and goes, Mrs. Anderson, it's the chaplain in two brass, we're sorry to tell you, your husband's been killed in a training accident. They went to the wrong person's house. And now they go to her and Rudy really is dead and she doesn't believe him. She doesn't know what to think. So in the book, we definitely give it from her perspective by working with that family. But we're near the close here, and Kennedy does something classy. He decides, I'm going to go down to Florida and thank the pilots in person. And so Jerry's all pumped. I'm going to meet the president. And his senior people go, Jerry, you're low man on totem pole. You have to stay in the hangar with the U-2 in case somebody of the president's entourage wants to see what a U-2 looks like. And Jerry's like, oh, great. So Jerry goes, after the president does this speech, he says the limousine comes into the hangar, Kennedy and everybody gets out, and he can hear Kennedy. He's only 25 feet away. Kennedy goes, you all stay in the limousine. I want to talk to that young man in private. So I end the book with just him and Jerry having this 25-minute conversation at the cockpit of the U-2, just these two guys who have both been involved in combat, and it's an interesting conversation. So I dedicated the book to Jerry. He looks like he could be my dad. And Jerry lives just up the road or down the road in Venice. He's doing just fine. But we also dedicated it to the U-2 pilots that were flying over Cuba knowing they were being tracked by the Soviet radar and could be hit by the surface-to-air missiles. And of course, to Major Rudy Anderson, found a way to serve his country in a different way, but we need more Rudy Andersons. Thank you so much.
Wow.
Thank you. Thank you.